Chalk Talk is brought to you by Isolite, the emergency lighting experts. Stay educated, my friends.
I don't know how it is where you guys are right now, but here in Philadelphia, spring is in the air, which is why that theme of rebirth and rejuvenation makes so much sense for our EMP Chalk Talk here this month. Good morning. I'm Evan Ackman. Greg and Matt are out on location, so I'm going to be both your master of ceremonies and your host today. And as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the EMP, our emergency LED drivers. And for you longtime Chalk Talk listeners, you'll know that we actually did do a Chalk Talk on the EMP and emergency drivers in general. Oh, good Lord, probably 2.5 or 3 years ago. But that was back when we weren't recording things. So we wanted to take this opportunity, and it felt very springy for us to go and get a new recording of this so that we have a video that we can put in our library. But even more importantly, we have some updates to the product line that I wanted to share with you this month. So as you would expect, we're going to do this in our traditional 3-act play. We'll start with some background. We'll talk about the definition of what an emergency LED driver is. We'll talk about some theory of operation stuff, exactly how it fits into a system. We'll actually jump into the wiring diagram, which is important to talk about and understand as kind of a base for the rest of the presentation, which I'm calling the need to knows section. I think in different presentations, if we're talking about like inverters or something like that, we might call this like the gotchas or the watch out fors, but like everything, this is trade-offs. These devices have a place in our life safety world. And so we're just going to talk about the electrical and mechanical things that you need to understand so that if you're going to specify these devices, you don't get caught by surprise by some of their behaviors. And then we'll end with the sales and marketing section. That's where we'll talk about the specific EMP updates. And then last, but certainly not least, we'll throw up our contact information and we'll tell you how to get more information about this or any of the other topics that you might be interested in. So you guys are on mute as always, but please, if you have questions, throw it in the Q&A, throw it in the chat. We'll make sure that we get to absolutely all of them before we get off the call here today. So I wanted to just start with a definition, just so that we're all talking about the exact same thing. And so when we talk about an emergency driver, we're talking about an electronic device that is furnished with a battery, and it sits on the low voltage, the LED side of a standard architectural LED driver. This emergency driver is going to illuminate the LED lights directly when there is a power failure. And so, as you would expect, we're still talking about NFPA 101 type devices here, right? These things in an emergency are going to spring to life and keep the lights on so that people can egress from the building. And as such, we have all of the same requirements that we're used to from all of our Chalk Talks about all of the different emergency lighting solutions that exist out there. So, that 1 foot candle average, it always has to be above 0.1 foot candles, that 40-to-1 max min ratio thing. All of that stuff still applies. The other thing that still applies here, and usually we talk about this as a detriment, but it really is just something that you have to keep in mind, is that these are battery-backed devices. Batteries are consumable, and so these devices do need to be tested on a monthly and yearly basis to make sure that they're still appropriate and they have the capacity to run the emergency lights for the required 90 minutes. The other thing to just draw your attention to, and sometimes there's some confusion about these different types of devices, we're talking about something that sits really behind the architectural LED driver. But there do exist small inverters. We have some of them in our product line that actually sit in front of the architectural LED driver, and they keep AC power energized in an emergency. Those would be what we would call like mini or micro inverters, and they're philosophically different things. I mean, they kind of fit in the same application, but they operate in a fundamentally different way, and they have a totally different set of trade-offs that you're going to be making when you go to a solution like that. And so they are really out of scope for this presentation here today. Now, just to kind of draw graphically what I just told you, this is kind of the theory of operation here, right? We have one big light fixture, this luminaire here. Inside of it, we have our architectural LED driver. This is like the driver that goes into every fixture in your building. We have our emergency driver, and look where it sits. It sits on the secondary side between the architectural driver and the LED itself. It also has a connection to power so that it can determine whether there's an emergency, and it can also charge its battery. And then what you get when there's a power failure, if I get my cursor working properly there, is all of this stuff over here goes away. The battery is now discharging into the LED directly. That LED stays on for 90 minutes basically is exactly how it's going to work. And so this is the logical sort of hierarchy of how these devices work. I want to just draw your attention to a much more literal wiring diagram because there's an important sort of differences here and just sort of to understand how all of this stuff works. And so I just want to draw your attention to a few things, right? This wire here and sort of like these wires are the ones that we saw on the previous slide, but we sort of ignored some of the other things that this device was going to have to do. First of all, this is a lighting control. It's drawn as a snap switch here, but any of the low voltage dimming technologies or even like 3-wire dimming would work here. It's important that this is there because what this means is this is actually how we determine when the LED driver gets power, right? So the emergency driver actually takes care of powering the AC driver. That's so that it's never double driving the LEDs basically. So that's one. So that's important to note. You see what we saw before, right? Like we actually wire the LEDs through the emergency driver. So that's not new to you. The other piece to this puzzle that I want to make sure that you understand is this 4-wire test switch and LED indicator. Remember a couple slides ago, I said that NFPA 101 is going to do that mandating of monthly and yearly tests. This is the vehicle through which that occurs, this test switch and LED indicator. That has to be wired up. You can effectively ignore this driver connector. That's just a disconnect so that you can service the LED driver if you have to. And so you can see there's a lot of wires. What is this? 7 wires, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 or 14 wires on this device. So there's a lot of stuff that has to be like wired in and got right for emergency drivers. We'll talk about that when we get to the electrical specification section, because sometimes it doesn't matter, but sometimes it does. But I do think that it's better to start and talk about the benefits. And these devices do have benefits that are worth discussing. So obviously it utilizes the existing LED fixtures. That's nice, right? You've got fixtures where people are in a building. It makes sense logically to just keep those things on when there's an emergency, right? They're just by definition in the correct place. It's nice because it's mostly the same wiring strategy for the building. There is that caveat that we just saw that you actually have to sort of double wire power to the fixture, right? We need the switched output from the lighting control as well as a sort of always on output from the utility so that we know when there's an emergency. But they don't have to be isolated from each other like you would an emergency circuit with a sort of a non-critical circuit. It doesn't require any additional control hardware. You don't necessarily need these like UL 924 ALCR type devices in order to do that determining of when you're going to be selecting from one power source or the other. All that stuff is built into the emergency driver. And maybe the nicest thing about these devices is in space constrained installations where you might not have electrical closet space to put an inverter in, this will not take up space in your electrical closet because it goes, on or near the fixtures themselves. And so they can potentially be a space saver in the same way that a mini inverter can be a space saver because it doesn't require electrical closet space. Now, with those benefits, there are some of these need to knows. And, I don't want to go as far as to say they're gotchas or downsides. They're just trade-offs that you have to be aware of when you're dealing with devices like this. And so the first is really totally a specification and design side issue that you have to plan for. And that's that you basically specify these emergency drivers at a wattage lower than the actual wattage of the fixture. Remember those slides, both the logical and literal slides that showed where this device sits. You don't want to overdrive the LED, and there's really not a feedback mechanism within the driver. And so if you have a 35-watt fixture, you want to have an emergency driver that is lower than that so that you don't burn up the LEDs. Keep in mind that means that your lamp output is going to be diminished in emergency mode. You're going to have to rerun photometrics to prove that you're meeting all of those NFPA 101 guidelines of sort of the foot candles along the egress path. You may have to hand modify some IES files to get there, but it's doable. It's not the end of the world, but you do have to be aware that you're not going to get full brightness with an emergency driver unless you've perfectly matched the wattage of the fixture with the wattage of the emergency driver, which just pragmatically speaking, just doesn't really happen that often. I mentioned this a couple slides ago that you do need to have a little bit of a wiring situation going on. You need to have a normally on power output from the utility so that you can determine whether there's an emergency or not, as well as the switched output from the lighting control. That way the device knows when it's supposed to kick into gear and energize the architectural driver. But that's, again, not the end of the world. You could use a 12.3 piece of Romex instead of a 12.2 and move on with life. But you just need to be aware that you do need to have those two live conductors coming to the fixture now. And then just one thing to note, it's not necessarily a gotcha or anything, but these devices are sort of independent from the control topology of the architectural driver. So if you've got a 0 to 10 volt system, for example, it wires the exact same way. You would then wire those 0 to 10 volt connections sort of totally outside of the emergency driver. They would go directly to the architectural driver. But the important thing is you don't really have to match the emergency driver with the architectural driver from a control topology standpoint. You got to get that wattage right, like we said before, but you don't really need to worry about that sort of the control stuff when you're specifying an emergency driver. Now, the last sort of set of gotchas is really related to the mechanical and sort of project management aspects of these devices. If you've seen an emergency LED driver, they're fairly large, actually. They're sort of bricky in nature, and that's because they have enough battery capacity to keep 25 watts of LED going for 90 minutes or a little bit more. And so they're designed to go into like a 2x2 or 2x4 troffer, which is fine for a lot of commercial office space. I'm sitting under a few of them right now. So these things definitely still exist, but you also have a lot more situations where you're ending up with fixtures that look like those over there on the right. So like an architectural downlight, that's actually a surface mounted architectural downlight, like an architectural linear, fixtures that are sort of taking advantage of the smallness and compactness of LEDs. All of a sudden, the emergency driver doesn't necessarily fit within that fixture. And what that means is that you can't necessarily order it pre-installed from the manufacturer. And that puts Sparky into the situation where he's got to go wire up those 14 connections on site. Again, not the end of the world. It's an attention to detail thing. They can get it right. But keep in mind that there are some jurisdictions that don't allow for remote mounting of LED drivers. You just need to check your local code to make sure that you understand what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And then in addition to the space for that remote mounted driver, you still in all situations have to find a location for the test switch in the LED, which may not be in the fixture. It might be just like a 6-inch plastic disc sitting next to the fixture, but you do have to find a location for that because, again, these are devices that need to be tested and monitored on a monthly basis. There are some project management headaches associated with having like basically the same fixture that operates in two different ways. You get a stack of fixtures and some of them have emergency drivers in it and some of them don't. Electricians probably are just going to go linearly, just pull them off the pallet and go install it. That may not be where the emergency fixtures are marked on the plans, although these days people understand that these devices get used a lot, so they'll be paying attention to that, but keep that in mind. And then lastly, it's more of a problem for the agent is if these devices need to be replaced down the line because the batteries are out, who does the customer call? Do they call the fixture manufacturer? Do they call the manufacturer of the emergency driver? It may not be clear where they're to go for support. So keep in mind, it's probably going to be a call to you guys as agents to sort of go and navigate that. Fortunately, if they're Isolite drivers, we're going to take care of you and just sort of make sure that everything's good, but it can result in some additional support load from your end. And that leads us to some updates. We've actually sort of changed our EMP product. And what we've done basically is we've added self-diagnostics to all of the units. So we have a 7, 12, and 25. Previously, they had no self-diagnostics. Now they all have self-diagnostics. Now we know that there are applications where that may not be a good thing. Things like restaurants or retail spaces where you don't necessarily want the driver to turn the lights on when they shouldn't be on for decorative reasons. And so all of these devices also have a switch that allows you to defeat that self-diagnostic feature. So all of them will ship with self-diagnostics on by default. If that's not desirable, you can override it with a little switch on the back, but all units ship with self-diagnostics. So how this is going to work is we've actually already discontinued the 25-watt driver, and we still have some 7s and 12s sitting around. And so we will formally discontinue those as soon as we're out, which is really going to be in the next probably 2 to 3 months. So, keep your eyes peeled for that. If you need the existing driver, you need to get that order in now, because we're only going to have the one with SD here in a couple months. The reason why you might care about that is the ones with SD are a little bit larger. So if you had a situation where it was going into a fixture and it was marginal before, there's a chance now that it might not fit. All that information is already available in the cut sheet. So go check that out before you place an order. It's important to just get that right, because the old ones are a different size, and I can't stress that enough. With that said, as I just mentioned, those spec sheets are already updated. That's on the web. The wiring diagrams and stuff all still apply. All the marketing assets that exist on the website are all still relevant. They haven't really changed. The electrical specifications of the devices haven't changed. So all of that is online right now. And then, as always, as a follow-up to this presentation, you're going to get the slides that you have access to. They'll be sent as a link to our website. You'll get a video of me giving this presentation, so you can see my annotations and you can hear my voice in the spring air giving the presentation. And then we'll also send all the sell sheets and marketing sheets as well. And we'll also send out a price book page. We haven't really changed the price on them, but I want to make sure that you guys have all the specific model numbers and their prices just nailed down. So we're going to send that all to you here in the next couple weeks as a follow-up. As you would expect, I'm Evan. Greg and Matt send their regards. They wish they could be here with you guys this morning, but they're out doing God's work. So if there's anything that we can assist you with, whether it's EMP drivers, emergency drivers in general, or anything else that we do, we know that you're out there doing sort of all the hard work. So if we can support you in any way, shape, or form, please do not hesitate to reach out for us. We answer our emails and our phones, and we love to support and assist our agents. With that said, enjoy the rest of your day, week, and have a good Easter for those of you who celebrate it. And we'll talk to you next month, where we have an exciting product announcement. So that's a little teaser for you. It's a big announcement, and that's a hint.